US champion Lex Luga versus Brian Pillman. I'll admit straight away that I've seen a lot more of Lex in the 90s, WWF and later, WCW than in NWA. I thought he looked really good, and as good as he's probably ever looked in the ring. I mean, I've heard it said before that like late 80s NWA Lex is best Lex. Is that right?
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, he was, in his peak shape, of course. But Brian was for lack of a better term, anal about his matches. He wanted to really go. So I'm sure he and Lex had really worked on some of that stuff and everything. But I thought the exact same thing you did. Excuse me. Whenever I was watching the match, because it didn't stand out in my mind as being memorable or something that was forefront of my head. But when I did watch it, I thought the same thing. Like Lex he's holding his own, and Brian could go. So. But, I'm sure Brian probably had a lot of conversations with him in doing that. And that to me shows, I think underscores my point about when the business started going bad. I apologize for this frog in my throat. Was that it allowed us to descend down to our lowest common denominator. We just stick to the basics and do this and do that. All you have to do is, a couple of moves and then stick into that. And nobody was coming in and getting anybody's ear and saying, hey, let's let it loose. Let's see what you can do. Lex usually stayed to that safe road, right? He had a sort of standard match that he would go through. But in this match, he very much had come out of that. I rarely seen him working like that, which proves to me that he could work like that, which proves to me that had he been prodded and pushed, we could have seen a lot more of that from him. And it's a shame that we didn't.
Having said that, actually, with Pillman as well, I'll get back onto Lex in a minute, but 5'9" versus 6'4". But the way that there's certain people like Randy Savage and Brian Pillman, obviously, who are 6 foot or under, but carry themselves so much bigger to the point that you didn't really notice the height difference that much. That much. And I think that's sort of credit to Brian of how to project himself bigger than he actually was.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm sure there's a few fans out there that aren't aware of this. Brian, shortly after birth, maybe was born with throat cancer. Mm-hmm. And that's why he had that very raspy voice. He also had this intense internal drive, having always been the runt, that's smaller than everybody. And again, I was a runt in those dressing rooms too. A guy that size came from a Division II school. Making the NFL was almost an impossible dream, like a fool's dream. And yet he did. And I'd spoken to some of his coaches, and it was because they would make comments similar to this. I've never seen anybody work harder than Brian Pillman. And, he was an incredible athlete. And the fact that he achieved what he did in his life, very few people get hit NFL, WWF, WCW, and all these other things. He had an amazing drive, which is why he was so meticulous on his diet. Everything he did was to the 25th degree. And so, how that would play out in just a daily life, we'd be in a restaurant getting breakfast, and he would, really almost belittle the waitress, make sure there's no butter on that toast, and I don't want any salt, and you tell the cook this and that and the other thing. And he had all these little sayings like white bread equals white death. All those things that he would always, spew about, because Brian, like I've talked to before about, like, we're at work. When we walk into that building, regardless if we're in gear or in the ring, we're at work. That's our place of work. Brian took that. Don't get me wrong, Brian had his fun and everything as well, but Brian took wrestling incredibly seriously, and which is why you see this, the loose cannon type of approach and matches that were sometimes almost maybe even overdone, because that's the way he approached life. He had started life with so many strikes against him, and somehow overcame those. He had an internal drive that I would think most people would be envious of, and that's the way it would play out. Like when he would get into that ring, he would really work his ass off.
So hopefully I've got my maths right here, but Brian Pillman was in the business for about 2 years at this point. Or he wasn't. He was less than 3, I'm pretty sure, because didn't he get in the revived Calgary Stampede promotion in '87? So how come he's already basically a veteran, plotting out matches and calling everything?
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure, but I'm trying to think back. I know that Benoit broke in the same year I did, and I think Pillman was either that year or the second next year, so either 82 or 83. I'm pretty sure of that. How he would be calling matches and have that sort of ring, what we call ring generalship, is, you know, the Harts, as you can see with Brett and we saw later with Owen, that, you know, Stu was a big stickler on that stuff, you know, and the way he taught, and, you know, it's renowned of the, you know, the torture chamber down in the basement and everything. You know, those guys, much like Ricky Steamboat would teach to me later, it's not the high spots, high spot A, B, C. It's the segues, the linkages between those. How do you segue from A to B to C to keep that storyline consistent and keep all that thing threaded together? Calgary was, because of Stu, was very, very strong on that. And so you go back and look at the names that came through Calgary, you know, like Neidhart, you know, it was more of the brawler style. Davey Boy Smith had come through there vicariously through England.
Dynamite.
Bret Hart, Owen Hart.
Dynamite as well.
Yeah, Dynamite as well, yes.
I'm trying to think who else. Mike Shaw was there later. Pillman debuted in November 1986, so this was about 3 years into his pro run.
Okay, yeah, so, and this is 86 we're talking, correct? As far as
this pay-per-view is 89. 89.
Okay, so yeah, so he's got, what, 6 years in at that point?
No, 3. 86, November 86.
Oh, he broke in 86.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry. You see numbers and throwing dates immediately. It's
I'm sorry. So yeah,
numbers are like Greek to me.
Yeah. So November 86 to October 89, and he's already sort of acting as a veteran of putting together matches, which is pretty incredible for someone of his experience. But I guess the Stampede territory is a hothouse, really. Owen Hart was the same, wasn't he? I mean, he seemed to be one of those people who picked it up almost immediately, if not immediately.
Yes. Yeah, and you know, keep in mind that the veterans in the business frowned on that. You know, if you were going to the ring with somebody that had, like, say, 10 or 15 years experience and start calling stuff to that guy, they weren't very amenable to that. And yet somehow Brian made that all work. You know, it's, you know, the popping in out of the different places between his contracts and the whole loose cannon thing. And, you know, there's so much more going on there. You know, that I know we talked about it before. Steve Austin and I talking about on his podcast several years ago about taking that 6-7 year point before you started feeling comfortable. Didn't master it, but getting comfortable in the ring. So the idea of opening your mouth and calling something at 3 years in, boy, that was ballsy. You know, that was really really different in the business then.